Disrupting Japan, Episode 13. Welcome to Disrupting Japan, straight talk from Japan's most successful entrepreneurs. I'm Tim Romero, and thanks for listening. Today we sit down and talk with Casey Wahl of Red Brick Ventures and several other companies. Now, Casey's just written a book on Japanese startups and Japanese startup founders. And last year, when he told me about it, he wondered if he and I were somehow competitors. But we're not. Right now, there's so little understanding of the Japanese startup ecosystem and so little overseas exposure of truly innovative businesses in Japan that the more people talking, writing, and podcasting about it, the better. In the immortal words of Arlo Guthrie, if 3 people do it, then it's a movement. Now, in the interview, we talk about 2 things that may require a bit of clarification for our overseas and particularly our U.S. audience. First and simplest, we mentioned Hayashi-san a number of times. Now, Hayashi-san is the founder of Digital Garage, which is one of the most successful internet companies here in Japan. And the second is Rocket Internet, which is very well known in Asia, but not so much in the U.S. So Rocket is a German company that clones successful U.S. startup models and deploys them in Europe, Latin America, and Asia. It's an interesting model, and Casey and I talk about the practicality of hiring a CEO to implement your or somebody else's business vision. Now, Casey's got some interesting experiences and a few important insights on this matter. There's a lot of other good ideas in here as well, but I think those need no introduction, so let's get right to the interview. Okay, I'm sitting here with Casey Wahl, founder of Red Brick Ventures and quite a few other companies. Thanks for sitting down with me.
Thanks a lot for making time and choosing to do this.
Now, you've had kind of an interesting path in that you have been on the founding team of half a dozen startups. Or more maybe now, right? Through Red Brick.
Probably not that many, quite honestly. So I think in terms of being on the founding team, there's the first company, which is Wahl, which is a recruitment company. My initial background comes through recruiting, and I've been doing that for 14, 15 years in Japan. Red Brick Ventures we set up 2.5 years ago. And really kind of the first idea was I felt like there was a change going on and there was kind of a momentum building and wanted to give back, right?
Right.
So the first idea was, we had a cool space and, all right, let's do a co-working space, but that's really kind of low value add.
Well, the Japan, Tokyo in particular, is littered with co-working spaces and accelerators. But I thought Red Brick, you guys had a very interesting model at first. You and your team came up with the ideas, you did the research to see that it was viable, and then you recruited the team to run it. In Japan, you guys are the only ones I know that are doing that successfully.
Well, now that Rocket Internet no longer exists in Japan, then,
right?
Yeah. So I don't know if it's quite successfully, but we've done it. So just kind of to continue with the origination story of it is, I was thinking, okay, here's a co-working space, low value add, right? So as I thought about what can we do, how can we get involved in the startup market, and we were feeling all of the energy of companies coming in. We were working with a lot of Japanese startups that wanted to go global at the time, so really wanted to do something in the space. And okay, as a recruitment firm, we've got this network. We can basically get an introduction to almost everybody. And I was starting to meet a lot of kind of 30, 35-year-old Japanese, like with top-class credentials, whether it's University of Tokyo, University of Kyoto, not so much, maybe more Keio and University of Tokyo, a little bit of Waseda in there. McKinsey, BCG, they all wanted to be entrepreneurs, but they weren't taking that last step. And whether it was a legal risk, the social risk type of thing like that. So it's like, okay, we can fill in this gap here. So it goes to the idea that you kind of mentioned right there. And actually, through recruitment, one of my clients at the time was Rocket Internet. So
all right.
I got to understand the inner workings of their business model very, very deeply, right? And what they would do is they'll take somebody very young who's very smart, whether they're coming from Goldman Sachs or a McKinsey type of thing. Maybe they're 26, 27, 28, kind of associate level. Right. Then they'll give them a CEO title, a very small kind of founding share, call them the founder, and then just go at speed and really scale the startup very leanly, right? So are they really the founder type of thing like that? How much is their share percentage? So there's questions in it, but the model tended to work.
So were you trying to replicate that exactly at first, or were you kind of adapt that to Japan?
And that's where the fun came in, right? Because basically thinking, okay, here's Rocket Internet. They want to come in Japan. They want to come in Asia. Japan's a very, very special market, right? And I think we can do it more successful. We know how Japan works. We're on the other side of the moat. I think very early on, we didn't want to have as sharp elbows. So
what do you mean by that?
I think Rocket's a cynical company. I think they do a lot to add value in many ways, right?
Right.
But it's the look analytically, where's an opportunity? Let's grow with scale. We don't necessarily pay people very well. We're going to work people extremely, extremely hard. To our vendors or companies that we're dealing with, we don't really treat you with respect, per se.
So just ruthless efficiency.
I think that's a much more articulate way to say it. So very quickly, we wanted to be Rocket with a heart. It became the tagline.
All right, I like that. But what was, specifically, what were the big things you had to change to have a heart?
I think the biggest part is just how you treat people is the first step of it, right? You really care. So we were doing that, and I think the biggest thing was we wanted these people to be successful. We didn't want a stream of, okay, we're going to close it down after 3 months or 6 months type of thing. We really wanted to help people become entrepreneurs. So I think it's just kind of being nice and being accepting and thoughtful and working within the Japanese framework. Going back to the earlier question about what we had to change was the shareholding structure. With at least what I had seen about Rocket, it's usually 0.5%, 1%, 2% is what they'll give the CEOs or the founders.
For the nominal CEO, it's like 0.5%?
In the local market. So maybe the global one, I would hope gets more than that, right?
Yeah.
So they're relatively small shareholdings. So we started out with 15%. Is what we were doing. And it was kind of the same model. It's a little bit of idea arbitrage. So the thought process was, okay, in the West, in Silicon Valley, mostly it's Silicon Valley, usually it takes a great startup idea, 6 or 7 years to get to Japan. Okay, we can see what's going on in the market, and we can do this in 6 months. So that's the idea arbitrage point of it. Then we had our own development team. At the time, it was outsourced developers that we were using in India. And then we had the network to draft in the CEOs or the founders. So we just had a roster of people that were interested in it. Then we test the concepts with them to bring in the right person. Then we put in the initial kind of seed capital, which is between about 5 and 10 million yen.
Okay. And so how many projects did you run through this?
So initially we did 3. If I wrap it up at the moment, so Shirebu Kids still exists. The original idea was we were looking at Zulily.
And this is infants and children's clothing, mostly foreign brands, right? E-commerce
The original idea wasn't just foreign brands. The original idea was, okay, it's going to be an e-commerce site really focusing on pregnant mothers, kids, kind of toddlers. What Hiroshi found, who is the CEO and the founder and really did become the entrepreneur of Shirebu Kids, Hiroshi was under the kind of the original agreement. Okay, here's 15%, and then there's achievements, more percentages come in, type of thing like that. But we just flipped it all around. So he was going to a bunch of VCs, going out into the market, and so were some of the other founders. And they were like, no, we're absolutely not interested unless the founder and the CEO has the majority share. And we were being that first rung of it. We had to switch the shareholding agreement, had to switch kind of who was the majority shareholder of this, right? So that was kind of a Kaizen process, right? Trial and error. And by the time it got to the pitch events, that was all changed around. The model was a little bit more viable at that time.
So at that time, he really was the controlling interest in that company.
The real question is, within this model, if you're bringing in those CEOs and founders, are they really entrepreneurs? Are they taking the risk type of thing? And it goes back to the definition of the entrepreneur.
Well, yeah, this is the thing that jumped out at me from your earlier description, is that you're looking at well-credentialed, early mid-career executives or people in consulting who want to dip their toe into entrepreneurship. And it would seem to me that you would get a lot of people that get buyer's remorse when they understand how incredibly difficult growing a startup company is. Did you run into much of that?
We did. We had a founder of one of the companies that we kind of initially went through all the agreements and pretty quickly decided, no, this isn't for me.
Just got cold feet at the last minute?
Kind of, right? Whether it was dealing with us being more foreigners, type of thing like that. Another founder wasn't full-time, was kind of hedging the bets, and it's more, okay, I'll work nights and weekends, and if the entrepreneur has to take the risk, maybe that person didn't take it. Kind of fully, right?
Yeah.
That became a semi-success, the one that was...
that's which one?
So we were trying to do a Path clone, Path, the private social network, right? So we pivoted, and it became a private social network for pachinko parlors.
That's a pivot.
It's not so much.
I think it's social network for pachinko parlors. Now we got to talk about this. What?
So I think it's not that much of a pivot. So the original concept's really there. It's just the target market, right? Uh-huh. So pachinko have a lot of restrictions about how they can communicate and how they can market to customers, right? There's a lot of legal restrictions to it. So they were very interested. Okay, here's a social network that's just closed to members that come to our chain of pachinko parlors or whatever it might be, and we can communicate with them. They're not allowed to do advertising in there because that is illegal, but they can communicate, here's our new kind of machine that's just come in. It's really loose. Why don't you guys come down?
I see. And since they're already registered and part of the family, it's not really advertising.
It's not really advertising, but that's when we decided to spin it off, right? So after it started to get picked up and we're having more and more kind of pachinko parlors be interested in it, basically I'm still a board member of this company and I'm still involved in this project that it's too far away from me. I don't want to touch it, so we spun it off. We just gave it to one of the pachinko parlors and exited that one.
Oh, okay. Huh. That's an interesting one. I hadn't heard about that before.
Yeah, it's just a quiet one.
Okay.
Could I talk about Justa a little bit?
Absolutely.
So I guess one of the services that we have going right now is Justa, right? And this is along the evolution of Red Brick Ventures, where initially we were trying to create entrepreneurs. And
Justa, so everyone understands, it's a startup jobs focused portal. What's the right way of describing it?
Justa is really focused on startups, right? It's for startup hiring and filling that niche.
Okay.
Now, I think the easiest way to describe it in current terms is a startup job board, right?
Okay.
They hate it when I say that.
Okay. So, what should we say?
So it's really focusing on that, and it's building. Hiring for startups is incredibly hard, right? So their personal network is usually where the hiring comes from, but it runs out pretty quickly after the third, fourth person by chance, and unless somebody's got a lot of energy and they're out meeting everybody that they possibly can. But what we found is it's a lot bigger than we expected it to be. So I think at this moment there's like 95 startups on there and some 270 jobs, and it hasn't even come out of beta yet.
Just as one of the first places I tell people to look when I've got inquiries from overseas about, I want to join a startup in Japan. I'm like, okay, go here. Look around.
I think it's great. It's fully bilingual, right? It's really seamless. And we have our first hires going on. We need a better tracking system on the backside. But we know of 3 or 4 success cases where it's actually happening. People got these hires for free. So we're into thousands of candidates already over there, new startups that we've never heard of. Sign up.
Given your background and expertise, that's a real natural fit for you it's that intersection, right, between startups and recruiting. And from my experience, the people who really hit the ball out of the park are the ones that find that unique overlap of like 3 particular skills they're good at. And this really looks like one of those because it really is well done.
Well, thank you very much.
So
when I was just first starting out becoming an entrepreneur, it was in like Fast Company. It was like a BCG matrix, one of those squares that you have type of thing.
Oh, yes.
And the most successful square you have is if you're in a growing market and you know that market, then your chance of success is like 85%. I'm throwing numbers in there, right, but it's much higher. It's like the dark green or type of thing. And if the market's not growing and you don't know anything about the market, your worst chance of success, right? So I think the startup market here is growing. We know recruitment, so we positioned ourselves in the right square.
Okay.
And then from now on we'll be doing 2 things. We'll be creating more of our own internal Red Brick services that are human capital related. Then the other side is still once a year we want to help create those entrepreneurs and really go back to do that.
Well, listen, one of the things we absolutely have to talk about now, you have just finished writing a book about entrepreneurship in Japan. You've gone around doing
something very similar to what I'm doing is...
Yeah, just a different medium.
Yeah. Talking to a lot of successful startup founders about their story, their journey, their advice. I know you've published in Japanese. Do you know when is the book coming out in English? And do you have a working title for it yet?
It should be published in February 21st in both Japanese and English. It'll be on Amazon Japan. If you're in Japan, you can buy it in major bookstores like Maruzen and Kinokuniya. The working title in English is We're Still Working on It, but...
Actually, that's not a bad title.
it could be a startup title, right? But it's really the 20 founding stories of Japanese entrepreneurs and how they're going to kind of lead the entrepreneurial future of Japan. So,
all right, and we'll have links to the Amazon, we'll have links to the book and everything up on the website.
Please.
So, because I'm far too lazy to actually read a book, what are the common traits among successful Japanese founders?
It's a tough question. I think the biggest one is just passion, right? It's a real passion for doing it. Being an entrepreneur and doing a startup is really tough. You get a lot of no's. You get a lot of people that don't believe into you. Things fall apart. Key people leave. How do you exist? How do you go on? Maybe funding doesn't work out. And you've got to have something deep to drive you through that.
Well, passion is one of those things that I've always been skeptical of. I mean, it's true. You need passion, but it's easy to be passionate about something that you're succeeding at, or you've already succeeded at. Is there anything you can look at that struck you as maybe either uniquely Japanese or surprisingly common among all these successful founders in Japan?
I think they fell into two patterns.
Okay.
Is you had your product-centered entrepreneurs, where it was a personal product or a personal problem that they were solving, and you're creating a product from that. And that's where the passion derives, right? And keeping the team small, and there was a large group that were about the product and service, and they're willing to separate themselves from that product and service when they can no longer grow it, or if they'll have a better home, in a different company type of thing. Then I think the uniquely Japanese part of it is the keisha. There's a certain set within the 20 kind of founding companies or founders that I spoke with that wanted to be keisha. Mm-hmm. And it's about leading a company and being...
Well, you have to explain keisha. Most of our listeners don't speak Japanese.
Let's see if I can do it justice. I'll probably need your help. But it's a business owner and a business executive is a simple one.
Yeah.
But the real wording of it, it's a weight and a responsibility. Your incentives are not to maximize profits in Japan. Your incentive is to create an organization, and the larger the organization you have, the better. And there's a lot of social status equated with that.
Yeah.
And keisha means I have responsibility for all these people under my watch, under my wing type of thing.
Well, and another thing is, and which I think ties directly with that, is in Japan, people are sort of CEO for life.
Yes.
People start a company expecting to die as the founder of that company, which is kind of unhealthy in an entrepreneurial context. But did you find like a large percentage of these successful founders still had that desire to keep ownership of their company forever?
I think there's a certain group, right, that fall into the keisha side of it. I think they're still young and they're still on the upward trajectory, so it's not like the dying grips, I'm just holding on because this is my baby, or this is my self-identity.
Oh, that's what it turns into.
or my family identity. But there's a determination to grow it.
Did you see any differences between the generations, the young successful entrepreneurs versus the guys in their 50s?
Actually, there was only one group that I interviewed that was in their 50s. I think there's a couple in their early 40s. Then most are in their early 30s. And then there's a few 20-year-olds type of thing. So it's mostly the younger generation that will be the future kind of entrepreneurs that want to change Japan.
Okay.
So if I look at just the Digital Garage, they built up that company and took a risk when I guess it wasn't as cool to be an entrepreneur. There wasn't the infrastructure. It was really when the internet was starting.
Yeah, they were founded back in 97, 6, something like that, pretty early on.
I think you used to work there, right? Yeah.
I did. They bought one of my old companies.
Okay.
That was much later, though.
But yeah, so they were pioneering the internet in Japan at that time. Now, I think there's a story that really stands out from Hayashi-san is I was asking him about taking venture capital. He was like, venture capital didn't exist back then.
Yeah.
It was more, if you want venture capital, okay, I can have like a big Japanese company say it's venture capital, but they still want all the guarantees of a loan. So he's like, I got a venture capital offer. They wanted me to sign about my house as being liability for this venture capital. And basically he said, fuck you, type thing. And that became his motivation in some part to grow things.
Well, that's something that's only changed fairly recently. I still talk to young founders and young entrepreneurs who will occasionally have a VC ask them to sign for the loan or to guarantee their investment. It's rare, but it still happens.
So I think, still on that spectrum of becoming more sophisticated about the venture capital funding, Japan still has quite a long way to go about that.
It is interesting how it's changed because, for example, when Hayashi-san was out trying to raise capital, I mean, there were groups like JAFCO have been around forever, but they were really more mezzanine financing. And now there is a ridiculous amount of seed financing available.
I think there's more seed than there is venture.
Yeah,
it kind of feels like that. Yeah.
There's a real Series A crunch here in Japan now. Both of us spend an inordinate amount of our time talking to Japanese entrepreneurs. So in your opinion, what do you think Japanese founders are good at? What are they weak at? We're painting with broad brushes here.
This is a very broad brush.
Yeah. And we'll drill down later. So,
I think Japanese entrepreneurs don't care. They just really don't care about the consequences, right? Because there is no, celebration of failure here for the most part. Society-wise, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Bankruptcy laws are still ridiculous that they can recover 96% of whatever's owned to the creditors when a company goes bankrupt. So it's the highest in the world. So for Japanese society being so homogenous and kind of move as a group very broadly, so for these people to become entrepreneurs, they're already breaking every kind of social rule that exists, right?
Right.
And it's changed recently, but, if you went bankrupt in Japan, they could take everything from you.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and even the corporate shield in Japan is much looser. Even if you're a CEO, and they can still theoretically come after the president's assets.
They've changed the law. I think it was last year, where it's kind of vaguely worded where we can only take enough, but we have to leave you with a livable lifestyle.
Oh, wonderful.
Something like that, right? But,
how reassuring.
So I think Japanese entrepreneurs they're willing to be themselves. Like, they're very much themselves for the people that I interviewed, right? And they're comfortable in their skin.
That's interesting, because I see something as kind of a contradiction here, because the people you would normally think would fit that mold would be kind of the outsiders, the artists, the people who didn't have another option, right? But a lot of the entrepreneurs, a lot of the founders I meet are from top schools. They're from Keio in particular. A few from Todai, a few from Todai, a lot from Waseda. So these are people with great career options, and they're still deciding to start up a company. So when you say they don't care, what do you think is making them take that gamble?
And that's part of what I covered in the book. And really for me, kind of as a recruiter, my personal passions is the psychology of it, right? And what is the motivation and why did you do this? And kind of exploring the past and the backgrounds. And actually, Kimura-san of Gunosui, who started up an ad tech company called Atlantis, he sold it to Gree for $26 million and was kind of one of the biggest exits at the time. He did it in a year after getting, 3.5 million yen in funding.
Yeah.
He's from Todai, so he's from the University of Tokyo. And kind of one of his comments was that there still are not enough of the most top-class people in Japan coming to startups. All his classmates at Todai, many of them don't come. People still go into big companies. People still choose that pathway. So why did this kind of subset decide to do it? I think it's really interesting, and it really goes back to that idea of, do I want to be a keisha? So some of them have an entrepreneurial influence in their life, whether it was a grandfather or an uncle or a father and they grew up in the household.
So they had a role model.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the other ones became more product-based, but again, they probably did a startup in college type of thing. Like one of their friends, usually they weren't the original ones. to say, here's my startup idea, let's do it. But one of their friends invited them in college or right after, why don't you get involved and do this? And then they found their own personal kind of project that they wanted on that they made successful.
Okay, let's talk about the overall state of startups in Japan. I mean, we've both been in this game for quite a while, and things have been getting so much better. But if you had to put your finger on one or two things that had to change to really accelerate the growth of startups, what do you think really needs to change? What do you think needs to be improved here in Japan?
I think the biggest thing is you just need sheer numbers, right? You just need a lot more numbers of startups, right? So how do you get more people to influence it? So you want more people to be exposed to startups, do an internship at a startup in college or they join one early in their career.
Right.
And they're more likely to become founders later on. And it's interesting through the book is people took two sides of employees owning shares of their companies. And most of the startup founders said employees should not own shares, right?
So most said employees should not own shares.
For the majority said it, and many said it very strongly.
Now that's a very different model than you see in the U.S. and Europe. So these firms were tightly held by the founder or by the founder and his investors? Who owned the shares?
Primarily the founder, and I think venture capital in Japan wants a single founder to own the overwhelming majority of the share. Not a group of co-founders for the most part. Generally, they want one guy who they can see and be tangible and be responsible for everything. But beyond that, there are a lot of cases where co-founders might own relatively equal shares type of situation.
So what was the logic behind not giving employees options or shares?
Because you can never get those back. And it's so hard to get it back, and it goes back to control. But then on the converse side, and this goes back to, I think, the original question, is if you give more employees in startup shares and they take those shares and they move away and they still get the return from it, they're going to probably use it to angel invest or start up their own company, and that money has to flow more, right?
Sure.
So there's getting to be more exits now, and some of the people that have exits, most of them are becoming angel investors to a certain degree, right?
Well, I think that is one of the most positive trends we've seen, is that I think right now, is the first generation of successful startup founders that are turning around and investing in the next generation. That really seems to be new now.
I think that the scale is, it's really kind of almost a pyramid, right? It's numbers that are coming. Through doing these stories, there was like NetAge back in the day.
Right.
There was one or two or three companies where the founder, who had an exit, usually an IPO at that time, was going back and investing angels to startups, and that this becomes a second generation that is becoming more successful, and now they're turning back into it. So the pyramid, the base of the pyramid, steadily getting a little bit wider in terms of the scope of it. I think probably the biggest thing that I'd love to see change is more venture capital. Actually, the people running and the investors having been ex-entrepreneurs themselves. I think still in Japan it's corporate VC.
There are very few, other than the angels you mentioned, most VCs are dominated by finance guys.
Yeah, it's
very smart guys. But
extremely.
Guys from, top school, MBAs. But actually, getting back to the control idea, was the desire for control, this is something that runs deep in Japanese society. So from the founders you spoke to, how much of that desire for control was sort of an instinctive cultural desire, and how much do you think really played out strategically?
I think most of it is cultural.
Yeah.
Right? I think it's probably 90% cultural. And if I guess the meaning of how did it play out strategically is, did somebody kind of lose control and they felt the personal pain by it, so they never want to experience that again?
Or did they lose good employees because they felt like they weren't part of the team?
I don't think that really happens in Japanese startups. And they're going back to that VC one man in control. There's still an idea in kind of Japanese business generally, and startups especially in particular, is you have the charisma president, the charisma shacho.
Right.
And this is one guy, and this is our visionary leader that leads us all to greatness. And there's a lot of people helping that person go along. And in many startups, they're underpaid.
Right,
Certainly
yeah.
That is the nature of a startup in some ways, but even as the venture grows, maybe they could add some of those profits or some of that back into the pay as well. So,
is that something that has changed with the age of the entrepreneurs? Or are some of the younger guys also very much wanting to stay in control and not give their shares up?
I think it's certainly changing, right?
Oh.
I think there's a generational change, and as you have more exits and the market itself becomes liquid, money in and money out type of thing like that, the idea of control is not necessarily as strong, right?
Right.
And especially for the product-inspired engineers, for entrepreneurs, for the entrepreneurs that are still about the KA or being that responsible kind of president type of thing, then obviously control's a different aspect.
Right. I really appreciate you sitting down with me. Let's end this on a high note, because we talked about like
I thought it was all high.
Yeah, it should be. But we've talked about like what the Japanese market needs to do and what needs to be improved. What do you think is the single most positive trend that you see in the market today for startups?
I think there's so many things going right.
You can give me a couple.
There's more exits, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot more exits, and the exits are getting, $20-30 million is kind of not becoming unusual, and it's happening. The funding's getting bigger. There's a lot more angel investment out there.
There's a lot more M&A exits than there used to be.
It didn't, like 3 years ago, it was unheard of.
I think it's a lot of the new companies, newly IPO'd companies are very acquisitive. Mm. So the Fujitsus and the NECs...
It's the DNAs and Grees and Rakutens and SoftBanks to a certain degree.
And so that might be, I think that is going to be a continuing trend.
Absolutely. And then you have the know-how. So people that have built it from 0 to 1 have the successful exit and can turn around and either be a mentor or do their next one. All the people that were employed there, even from the intern, they had a great opportunity and
hopefully more and more of those guys have stock options and they can all go out and start new companies.
Hopefully. Yeah.
Well, it's a lot to look forward to in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think it'll be good.
Well, Casey, this has been great.
Oh,
thanks a lot for sitting down with me.
And we're back. Now, Casey's points on the cult of the founder that exists in Japan were interesting, and it was particularly fascinating to learn how many founders did not want to give their employees equity, even today. Now, in my experience, this is changing as more and more companies are founded by teams rather than individuals. But the need for control, or perhaps more accurately, the need for the illusion of control, runs very deep in Japanese society and business culture. And also, the question of whether entrepreneurship and building a startup can be systematized is an interesting one. I think it's clear that to some degree it can. On one side, we have people like Steve Blank, who are finding repeatable patterns, abstractions, and blueprints. And on the other side, there are companies like Rocket Internet, who are trying to develop genuine startup factories. And there are many, many companies like Rocket that clone American startups. Rocket's just far and away the most successful and metrics-driven of them. But Casey's point was an interesting one, that in Japan, outside investors and employees themselves were highly skeptical of the disposable company and employee model of Rocket. But time will tell if those VCs are simply behind the times or if their views are based on the reality of the commitment required to succeed in the Japanese market. If you want to see the links and resources that Casey and I talked about during the interview, or to get in touch, go to disruptingjapan/show013, and you'll find all of that and more in the resources section of the post. And if you have something to say about startup clones, startup jobs, or Japanese startups in general, leave a comment and let us know what you think. If you have some ideas on how to improve the show or know someone we should be talking to, send us an email at feedback@disruptingjapan.com. But most of all, thanks for listening, and thanks for supporting the show and letting people interested in Japanese startups know about Disrupting Japan. This is Tim Romero, and thanks for listening.